So I haven't been filming stuff for some time because I haven't really been doing the type of sewing that would lend itself to a tutorial or any kind of video really, so yes. Also, I've mostly been doing research, like the boring theoretical part of fashion history, so I thought I might just do a little video on that because I vaguely recall someone on some video asking for me to show my book collection, and now it's grown significantly, like over the past few months, so let's do that. And I'm refraining from classical categories. I'm going to use my own categories of book here because that already annoyed me when I was studying literature, all these categories of what kind of book is what kind of book, so I don't care, I make up my own. It's way more fun. And we'll start with category number 1, which is museum catalogues. These are very important. If there was such a thing, I would call them primary sources. The actual primary source for fashion would be the actual garment itself, but that I do not have, so this is my personal version of primary sources. We have different museum catalogues that are similar but not all quite the same, and I'm going to go into detail on these books now. Here we have Fashion, which is a costume catalogue of the Kyoto Fashion Institute, Kyoto Costume Institute, sorry. And you don't get that too often, and I couldn't even find out whether they're still open, whether you can go visit. So this is pretty much invaluable, and it doesn't cost that much. It's pretty cheap these days. I have the 2-volume, very large version. There's different ones. There's one where there's like all in one book, but it gets really big. So I prefer this one, and especially the first volume, where there's all the 18th, 19th century stuff. It's very worn out, I have to be careful. And this was the first fashion book I bought, pretty much. And it's also still a massive inspiration. This is just a very, very great book. There's also little explanations next to the dresses, but it doesn't really focus on one subject too much, so it's good for introduction. It's not so good if you want to become a specialist on any given subject. It's more like a very vague overview of a European fashion. Next one. Here we have Style and Splendour, the wardrobe of Queen Maud of Norway. Sometimes you have these special collections from one very important fashion collector or very fashionable person, and these tend to get rather costly because they don't print a whole lot of those, and they're usually in very good quality paper. So this one was a bit expensive for me personally. I usually try to get used copies on Amazon, but this was still like $40, so it was still cheap considering. And it truly has a marvelous collection, from court gowns to more leisurely clothing, and pretty much just everything from before her coronation until her death is represented. She was a very fashion-conscious, classy dresser, so this one is very, very nice if you want to focus on one specific person and what they did during their lifetime with their wardrobe. That's always very interesting. Here we have House of Worth, The Gilded Age, which is from a collection in the Museum of the City of New York, and it pretty much just consists of this little, I'm tempted to call it a leaflet, where there's a little bit of information about Worth, and then it's just pictures of the dresses that were exhibited, and that's it. And this one was quite expensive too, because it's so rare, because it was printed couple of decades ago and there aren't many left. This was just for this one exhibition in this one museum for a short amount of time. If you can get your hands on this, if you're interested in Worth, this is very well worth buying. That's a very small book. It's just called Shoes. It's again in German, as many of my early books are, and it's just about shoes. That's it. Very informative read, especially since the shoes always get a little lost in the costumes because you don't always see them. This is very interesting, because as they say, you don't know a man if you haven't walked a mile in his shoes, so you always need to consider the footwear at least. Then we have the Fashion in Detail series from the Victoria and Albert's Museum. Those are very, very informative. There are more in this series, but those are the only two I have. And they are very, very good if you want to recreate a certain type of silhouette or a certain type of dress. Usually with these books you get a detail of a certain type of dress on the right side and a little explanation of the dress and a pretty good drawing on the left side. So this is a pretty good reference if you're trying to recreate a specific type of dress, but you don't learn a whole lot about the period in itself. So this isn't exactly for beginners. If you want to learn just about something in general, this is not the book for you to buy. This is really for something specific when you're trying to focus on one type of dress, and there's a reference in this book, then this is a good book for you to buy. Most of this stuff is in the online catalogue of the Victoria and Albert's webpage, but it's not easy to navigate. You don't really find stuff there, so it's there, but it's not easy to use. So it's actually better to just buy this book. It's really good. And I'm just realizing that I keep telling you guys to buy books. Don't buy anything just because I said so. I'm not doing advertisement for any of these. I'm just telling you what I use for research. If you're interested, you can have a look at those. So these two are amazing. I love them both to death. It's Costume Close-Up, Clothing Construction and Pattern, and Regency Woman's Dress. And those are very, very helpful if you're trying to actually recreate a dress, but you need sewing skills for this. You need to know the terminology, you need to know a little bit about the period, you need to know about the fabrics, because this book alone, these books alone, will not help you with that. It's not like a how to make a Georgian dress out of a towel and a paperclip with no sewing type of deal. So you need to know what you're doing, but if you know what you're doing, these books are really going to help you. I'm going to show you in some detail how they work. This is Costume Close-Up for one, and in this one it's explained how a shift is made out of linen, and you see the little text. This is actually a very varied book, so there's color images, there's black and white images, there's other kind of images like drawings, as you can see here, and usually there's a scale on the right and the bottom, so you can scale it up and make your own shift out of this. Also, the explanatory text goes into great detail as to what type of stitch was used on which seam. It's kind of complicated, you have to get into it, you have to know the terminology, but once you do, you realize that mostly you've done your dresses all wrong all the time. At least this was the case for me, because they used way simpler stitches than I did. I was really overdoing it in my dresses so far, like always having the neat stitches, and they just did like very, very simple like catch stitches and stuff like this, very quick stuff that you don't see from the outside, and it didn't have to be completely finished the way we're used to it right now. They even left some seams open and stuff like this. So this is what I learned here, and that was very informative. And if you know how to deal with scaling up a pattern, and if you know all the stitches and the words for sewing related stuff and for the period, you can actually recreate something just using this book. So this is very neat. Not for beginners though. This is Regency Woman's Dress, and this works very similarly, although the scaled patterns actually have like a square pattern on it, so you don't have to measure anything yourself. I have to warn you though, some of the scaling thing isn't done properly, like they didn't do the correct measurements. For some, especially the early ones, like the corsets, the measurements just don't work. It would be for like a 5-meter woman, the type of stays, and then I tried to recreate if I had used those actual measurements. And usually you have an explanation. They don't go into such great detail about the stitches and the seams, but you usually have pictures, a little drawing, and then there is the pattern on the right side or on the next page. Also in the front, the most useful thing about this book is this page in the front actually. There are little drawings of all the dresses that are shown in the book, and if you look at it very closely, you can see how it actually describes the subtle changes going on during this era. For example, I was always wondering about the rising and dropping hemlines and how the necklines changed very, very much from a very low square with the shoulders very far apart to this very high-necked, roundish thing. And also the waistline, it just keeps going up and down. And this one actually explains it very well. So if you want to know the subtle differences between Regency dresses and what's appropriate for what decade, this is a very good book.